Good morning. Here we are again at Temple Baptist Church in Shiloh Sunday School class, and we're glad to have you all again. We appreciate all the tuning in and the different views that come across on YouTube during the week, and hope you all are getting something out of this. We are in Luke chapter 6 today. We're looking at the first 11 verses of that. It's kind of for some people, it can be a little bit controversial. And others, we just accept what God says and accept it at face value and move on with it. And so anyhow, we see in the very beginning there in chapter 6, it says, "And it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first." That's kind of a confusing little statement there, but the thought there is that in the harvest, it had to do with the harvest of the, it says here in the King James Version, a lot of your other translations, it uses the word, rather than corn or cornfields, it uses the word grain, which is actually a lot more correct. In the culture of that day, there was the crops was in Israel at that time. The crops was barley and wheat. There was no such thing as corn, and these are translations out of the old King's English in that. But when you look at the background of that word, you're looking at something that means it's like an umbrella statement over all kinds of grains and ultimately corn. But they didn't actually have corn in Israel in that day, but it was a word that is used there. But anyway, to get back to the point on that, during the Passover time, the time of the year this was, the barley was done first. And then after the Passover time, then the wheat crop came along, and so that's where it's talking about. It came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first. That's how we know about what time of the year that was in the harvest time. And the Pharisees and scribes, we see them. They're beginning to lay their groundwork to actually crucify Jesus. At this point, they're wanting to try their very best to, to discredit him because he's gathering a multitude of people that are following him all over the place. And they're what you have to understand is that Jesus was flip-flopping the culture. In our country here, we believe in the separation of church and state, but in that time, the state was the church, and the church run the state pretty much. The high priest and those people, and so it was a different culture. And Jesus was just turning everything upside down. And he was trying to teach these people that to have mercy and compassion on your fellow man was much, much better in God's eyes than trying to follow the letter of the law. The law, whether it's civil law or whether it's God's law, it's all good. But the law, in this and the Old Testament law, it was given to be a mirror to show the people that their spiritual condition. And by the time these Pharisees and scribes got finished with it, they had this thing that they came up with called the Mishnah, and it was a written copy, written in book form, of oral traditions, things that they dreamed up. Well, if the law says this, and the old law in the book of Leviticus or back in Deuteronomy, and if it says this, well, we're going to add a little bit to it here to try to exert our authority a little bit more. But in the process, what they started out was something that was good and with good intentions, and then before they knew it, it got to be so legalistic that people couldn't even breathe. And this is the place that we're coming to here. It says there in verse 1, and it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first that he went through the cornfields. Now this is talking about Jesus. In that day, again, they didn't have 4-lane highways or blacktop roads out here like we have out here on Barron Road. They had trails, and they were walking trails. People walked everywhere they went, or at best maybe rode a donkey if they really had a lot of money. And they might have a donkey, but most of the time, even if they had that, they had the donkey loaded down with goods. And so they walked everywhere they went. And the law, back in the book of Deuteronomy, it talked about, I had that listed, I don't know if I could find it again, but it talks about in chapter 23 and verses 24 and 25, and I want to read those to you so I don't mess it up. And it says, when thou come, and this is the book of Deuteronomy now, chapter 23, verses 24 and 25, and it talks about what the law says about harvest, and we will get to that back over in the book of Luke here in a minute. It says, when thou comest into thy neighbor's vineyard, then thou mayest eat grapes, thy fill, all they want. You could eat all the grapes you wanted to as you walked through another man's vineyard, and there was no law against that. But, and we always have that but there to consider in this thing, it says, then thou mayest eat grapes, thy fill, at thine own pleasure, but thou shalt not put any in a vessel. You couldn't go in another man's vineyard and sit there and eat grapes all day and then fill up your bag to take home for supper. That was against the law. You just could not do that. But he goes on and he says then more to the context of what this lesson's about today. It says, when thou comest unto the standing corn of thy neighbor, that thou, and remember now, we're talking about grain. We're not talking about sweet corn or something like that. It says, when thou comest into the standing corn of thy neighbor, then thou mayest pluck the ears with thine hand. But, we have this but once again, it says, thou shalt not move a sickle unto thy neighbor's standing corn. You could not go in there and you could get your grain and eat the grain, or we could go along with the analogy and say to roast an ear or something, and you could do that, but you could not go in there with a machete or something and cut his corn down and take it with you to have later on, because that was considered work. And besides that, that was God's way of protecting the integrity of the farmer. And there's something to be said about that. But then it says there in the last part of verse 1, it says, and he and his disciples, and I keep going back to in that day, because you have to have a little bit of an understanding about the culture that they lived in. Jesus was considered a rabbi. He's called a master over in other parts of the scripture. Probably next week we'll be looking at that part. But he was a teacher, a master, but he had his disciples, and it was like his class. And they were walking through, and these disciples, it says, and his disciples plucked the ears of grain and did eat, rubbing them in their hands. And they broke the husk off of them, and then they ate the seeds on the heads of the barley or the wheat in this case. But that's when all of it hit the fan, because they wanted to consider in their oral traditions, they wanted to consider that was work, and they we just can't allow this. These people were so ultra religious and so legalistic is the word that I'm looking for in this. And then it says, certain of the Pharisees said unto them, why do you that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath days? That was a bad mistake to try to outdo Jesus on the law. He'd been rubbing their noses in it up to this point. Every time they would have a head button thing, they'd come out on the bottom, and they ought to have known by then that they were not going to win that. But they nonetheless, they were trying to do that. They come up with this thing, and they said, why do you, and certain of the Pharisees said unto them, why do you do this why do ye that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath days? And we get into this thing, the Sabbath day, the rest day. The Scripture tell us not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together, as a matter of some is, and so much more as the days come near, that talking about the end of days, that we ought to be in church. But we always have this thing of, well, I don't have to be in church to worship God. Well, the Scriptures say that it was Jesus' habit to be in a synagogue on the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day is in Scripture that we're talking about here. It's not always to them like would have been Saturday. It was not always on that, but it was on the religious holidays. But people, the men, I think, were expected to go to the Passover at least once, maybe twice every year. And these, we get hung up on this sometime, that if we're not in church, then we're probably just backslid or bound for hell or whatever. But yet, the Sabbath was created for man, not man for the Sabbath. And it's a situation where yes, we can worship God anywhere we're at, but will we? That's the last part of it, but will we? And that's where it goes. He said, why do you do that which is not lawful to do on the Sabbath days? To get back to the point here in the Scripture, that's and that cultural thing was that Jesus was responsible for these men, these disciples that he had. And that's why they were asking him, why are you allowing these people to do these things? And they were hanging on their law, and this teacher was responsible for these actions of these men. He was their leader and therefore responsible, and that's where they come from. And Jesus, he wanted to teach them, to make this a teaching moment. Jesus was a master teacher, and everything was a teaching thing to him. It makes me think of our daughter Susan when the girls were born, and as they were being raised up, everything she did with them was to teach the kids the right way to do. And that was her thing. And even right now, up in heaven, I just know in my own mind, she's got some younger Christian up there discipling them, because that was her gift, and she was good at it. But anyway, to move on with this, Jesus says, and this was really a put down to these guys. Then he said, and Jesus answering them said, have you not read so much as this, what David did? And he's letting them know that, hey, you guys are a lot more ignorant than you think you are. You're talking about what my disciples are doing, and you're way off base with it. And he's saying, have you not read so much as this, what David did when he himself was hungry, and they which were with him? And then back in 1 Samuel, it tells that story there, how that David was running from Saul, and he came to this place that was called Nob. It was a little, and that means high spot. It was a place just outside of Jerusalem, and it was a place where the priests gathered and they stayed. It was almost like it was a school for the priest. I wouldn't write that, and that's probably not in the King James Version, but yet it's that's what it was. It was a place where these priests came together and they studied, and there was a tabernacle there, and it says there that he went into the house of God, and that's what it means. There was not a masonry, a block temple or anything like that. It was a tabernacle there. And he said he went into the house of God and did take and eat the showbread. Now, back in there in 1 Samuel, David well, David just told a lie, really. He said he had been sent from the king, and he got the showbread, the bread off of the what's the word I'm looking for, Brother Ron? There was a table there on the right, and it was a table of showbread, and it was the bread of the presence, representing the people in front of God, and it stayed there from Sabbath to Sabbath, and it was changed every time. And then what was left at the end of that time, that old bread was left. The priest could eat that. And David, he came and he wanted that some of that bread. And it's kind of interesting that he wanted it, but even in David showing mercy and compassion for the priest in that day, he didn't even ask for all of it. He didn't take all of it, which he could have, but he did not. He asked for 5 loaves for him and his men. And they gave that to him, actually. And also they had Goliath's sword was there. And they gave that to David. And he took it, and if you follow that story on out in the next chapter back in 1 Samuel, when Saul found out about that, he called Ahimelech, was the priest at that time, called him and all the priests to Saul's presence, and actually he murdered all of them. The scripture says 85 of them he murdered because they let David take that showbread. And so anyway, we'll move on from there, because there's a point here that he wants to make, that in that tabernacle thing there. And as that went on, Jesus is wanting to show these Pharisees that he is the Lord of the Sabbath, and God is that. And he goes on in verse 4, and he said, he went into the house of God and did take and eat the showbread, and gave also to them that were with him. And that was that 5 loaves that they divided up there, and which it is not lawful to eat, but for the priest alone. And I kind of told you how that went. But then he dropped this thing here, and he said unto them that the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. God is in charge. God was with David. He did not notice in that David was he told that story, which probably should not have done, but he did. And there was a bad result of it when it was all said and done. But it shows God's mercy that church is important. It's very important that we come to church. I don't think you can come to church too much. But then if I was going 7 days a week, I might change my mind on that. But yet we see the time that God is in charge, and he's sovereign in all things. And he knows if we have an occasion to be somewhere else, there's a possibility that we may not be here tomorrow night. I don't know that for sure. But we may not be. But God's not going to condemn us for that, because the scripture says that he judges the thoughts and the intents of the heart. And now I'm not giving you a license class just to go out and not come to church, because Jesus, if we're going to be Christ-like like Jesus was, then we need to do what he did. And to have compassion and understanding, just like this priest did, even though he probably didn't know it was going to cost him his life, but yet he had compassion. When you see that word mercy, especially in the Old Testament, that's what it means, is compassion. Mercy and compassion, it goes hand in hand. Most places it's interpreted either way. You can use either word in that. More to this story here before I run out of time, because he's going to make this point again. And he said, it came to pass on yet another Sabbath that he entered into the synagogue, and there you go again, and taught. Paul, that's where Paul went. They always went to the synagogue, because that was an open door for them to share the gospel, and that's why they did. And he said there was a man there whose right hand was withered, and the scribes and the Pharisees watched him. and whether he would heal on the Sabbath day, because there again, in the Mishnah, they were considering that as being, as work, as laboring, and that they might find an accusation against him. They were again, just trying their best to find something that they could get Jesus convicted of, to where they could kill him, ultimately kill him. First of all, they were just, they was wanting to discredit him and put him out of the way. And the more they kind of got their nose rubbed in everything, that turned a lot to trying to find a way to kill him and then ultimately to find somebody else to do it for them. And so that's part of that deal. They were building their case in that, and it says, and it came to pass on another Sabbath that he entered into the synagogue and taught. And there was a man whose right hand was withered, and the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to whether he would heal on the Sabbath day. And there again, that they might find an accusation against him. They were building this case up on Jesus that whole time. It says, but he knew their thoughts and said to the man that had the withered hand, or he's saying, arise, stand up in the midst of the crowd there. And he said, then he arose and stood forth. And then Jesus said to them, he never touched the man in any way, shape, or form. But he just said, then Jesus said unto them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath days to do good or to do evil, to save a life or destroy it? And they were beat, and they knew it. Any way they answered that question, they were going to lose, and they knew it. And he said, and looking around about them all, we hear this thing about our wives will give us the look. That's what I think Jesus was doing to these people. They were getting the look from the Son of Man that was in charge. And it says, and looking round about upon them all, he said unto the man, stretch forth your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored whole as the other. And we see Jesus again doing a miracle, but all he did was ask the man to stand up and to look. And he looked at him, and I can just see them. I bet he had really black, hard eyes. I think, and that's me adding to it, I guess. But I think when Jesus looked at you, it's kind of like, I think about my dad. My dad had real green eyes, and if he was mad at you and he put that look on you, it just about melt you in your tracks. And I think that's the way Jesus was with these guys in that. And he said he did so. He told him to stretch his hand out, and he said when he did so, it was healed completely. Not halfway, not a little bit, but healed completely in that. And so he says, and they were filled with madness. And that word in the context, the way that's written there, that was uncontrolled rage is what that meant. They just, and they communed one with another about what they might do to Jesus. When you read this story over in the book of Mark, and it talks about that, it was a lot blunter than that. It wasn't what they might do to Jesus, but how they might kill him. Well, that's kind of the lesson today, and it kind of shows the sovereignty of God. It shows that we are more correct to have compassion and mercy upon our fellow man than we are to be sticklers for the law. When we have an opportunity to do good, then do it, and God will bless that, and we'll look at that some more later on. But that's going to do us for today. Thank you for your comments and your viewing, and we'll get back with you next week.